All right, this is Gilgamesh chapter 1. It is on page 28 of your textbook. I expect you to be following along as I read this. To start out, we have our main character, Gilgamesh, who is the king of Uruk. Chapter 1. Gilgamesh angers his people with his arrogance and selfishness. The gods create Enkidu to teach him humility. Notice the strong walls of our city of Uruk. These walls were built by Gilgamesh on a foundation created in ancient times by the 7 wise men, who brought great knowledge to our land. The top of our outer wall shines with the brightness of copper, but it is made of burnt brick. Now study the inner walls of our city. Examine the fine brickwork. These walls, too, surpass all others. No human being, not even a king, will ever be able to construct more impressive walls than Gilgamesh built around our city of Uruk. Now approach the majestic temple of Anu and Ishtar. No mortal, not even a king, will ever be able to build a structure as beautiful as the one Gilgamesh created. Climb up and walk upon the walls of Uruk. Examine the fine brickwork. Admire the majestic temple of Anu and Ishtar. Gaze upon one man's supreme achievement. Who was the Gilgamesh who built these walls of lasting fame? Who was the Gilgamesh who built this most majestic temple? Gilgamesh was the renowned king of the city of Uruk. To his people, Gilgamesh was a tyrant who became a great hero. Gilgamesh left his city to learn how to avoid death, and he returned having learned how to live. In the course of his travels, he saw everything throughout the land. Because he thought about what he had seen, he came to know everything that makes a person wise. When Gilgamesh returned, he inscribed his travels and his thoughts upon stone tablets and placed these tablets on the strong walls of Uruk. He described the time before and during the Great Flood. He described his long, tiring journey in search of everlasting life. And he revealed the hidden mysteries of life and death that he had discovered. He wanted his knowledge to help his people improve their lives. Read what Gilgamesh inscribed in stone upon the strong walls of the city of Uruk so that you, too, may gain wisdom. Gilgamesh was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. His mother was the wise goddess Ninsun. His father was the noble Lugalbanda, a mortal who had also been king of Uruk. Gilgamesh was such a godlike person that his people knew the gods had favored him. Nintu, the great mother goddess who had fashioned the first human beings out of clay, had also created Gilgamesh. Radiant Shamash, god of the sun, had given him great beauty. Adad, god of storms, had given him great courage. Ea, god of wisdom, had given him the capacity to learn from his experiences and to become the wisest of men. Yet, despite his goddess mother and all of his divine gifts, Gilgamesh was not a god, but a man. Therefore, he was doomed to share the common fate of all human beings, which is death. When Gilgamesh was a young king, he was as willful and fearsome as a wild bull. He was the supreme wrestler and warrior. He knew no fear. He had no respect for tradition. He used the sacred drum as he wished. He did whatever he wished, even when it hurt others. The fact that his behavior disturbed his companions did not restrain him. Finally, the nobles in Uruk became very distressed by Gilgamesh's behavior. They complained to one another, "Gilgamesh is incredibly arrogant both day and night. Is this the way our king should act? Is it true that the shepherd of our strong-walled city should be bold? But a king should also be majestic and wise. Gilgamesh interferes in the lives of his subjects beyond his right as king. Even in the households of his nobles and warriors, he intrudes between husband and wife, between mother and daughter, and between father and son." The heavenly gods heard the complaints of the nobles of Uruk and met in assembly to discuss Gilgamesh's behavior. Anu, father of the gods, called the mother goddess before the assembly and said, "You created the hero Gilgamesh, mighty and wild bull of a man that he is. Now create an equally strong and courageous man, Enkidu, to be just like Gilgamesh. Make the spirit in Enkidu's heart like that of the warrior god Ninurta, so that it will match the untamed spirit in Gilgamesh's heart. Then send Enkidu into Uruk and let these 2 giants among men fight with one another. Enkidu will teach Gilgamesh his proper place in the world. Gilgamesh must be forced to recognize that, godlike though he is not a god. Once he learns that he has limitations like all human beings, then the people in the strong-walled city of Uruk will be able to live in peace." When she heard these words, Nintu conceived in her mind the image of a second heroic man, whom she created in the form of the god Anu. She washed her hands and pinched off a hunk of clay. Very carefully she drew the design she had envisioned upon it and threw the clay upon the broad, grassy plain a 3-day journey from Uruk. Thus she created the hero Enkidu. Enkidu came to life as a fully grown man. In some ways he looked as much like an animal as like a man, for his entire body was covered with shaggy hair. Long hair sprouted abundantly upon his head like rich fields of wheat. Like the god of cattle, he clothed himself in animal skins. Enkidu lived like a wild creature, away from the company of human beings and among the animals of the plain. He was aware of neither people nor land. Like his companions, the gazelles, he fed upon the grass of the plain. Along with the wild beasts at the watering place, he pushed for his turn to drink. One day a hunter, who lived by trapping the wild animals, discovered Enkidu drinking at the watering place with the wild beasts. Amazed by the sight of such a strange human being, the hunter returned to the watering place on each of the following 3 days. Each time he stared in fascination when he saw Enkidu among the wild animals. Each time the sight of the mighty savage so frightened the hunter that he took his hounds and returned to his home, where he sat in silence, terrified of the wild man. Finally, the hunter said to his father, "For the past 3 days I have seen a wild man at the watering place who appears to have come out of the hills. He is so strong that surely he is the mightiest in the land. In fact, the spirit of Anu, father of the heavenly gods, must live within his body. From what I have been able to observe of his habits, he seems to wander over the hills. He feeds with the gazelles on the grass of the plain, and he drinks at the watering place with the wild beasts who gather there. I am too afraid to approach him," the hunter confessed, "and yet he is robbing me of my livelihood. He fills in with dirt the pits I dig, and he tears up the traps I set. He releases the beasts and the smaller creatures of the plain whenever my devices catch them, and I can no longer capture any game." His father replied, "My son, the heroic king Gilgamesh lives in the strong-walled city of Uruk, which is only 3 days' journey from here. No one is mightier than he is. Even this wild man of whom you speak cannot possibly equal his strength. Gilgamesh is so strong that the spirit of Anu must live within his body. Therefore, you must go to the strong-walled city of Uruk and tell Gilgamesh about this mighty wild man. Bring back a priestess from the temple and let her educate this savage man in the ways of human beings. Let her meet him at the watering place. He will be attracted by her beauty. Once he embraces her, the beasts on the plain will regard him as a stranger and will associate with him no longer. He will be forced to become a human being." The hunter took his father's advice and followed the road to the strong-walled city of Uruk. As soon as the king heard the hunter's tale, he sent a priestess from the temple to teach the wild man how to act like a human being. After a journey of 3 days, the hunter and the priestess reached the home of the hunter. They spent the entire day sitting by the watering place, but Enkidu never appeared among the wild beasts. Early on the 2nd day, the hunter and his companion returned to the watering place. They watched as the wild beasts and the creeping creatures came there to drink. Finally, Enkidu, the mighty savage who was accustomed to feeding upon the grass of the plain with the gazelles and drinking at the watering place with the wild beasts, arrived. "There he is," the hunter exclaimed. "That is the savage man I have brought you to see. As soon as he sees you, he will approach you. Do not be afraid, for I am certain he will not hurt you. Let him get to know you and teach him what it is to be a human being." Enkidu was fascinated by the woman, and he spent 6 days and 7 nights with her. He forgot the grassy plain where he had been born, the hills where he had roamed, and the wild animals that had been his companions. Later, when he was ready to rejoin the wild beasts of the plain, they sensed that Enkidu was now a human being. Even the gazelles drew away from him in fright. Enkidu was so surprised by their change in behavior that, at first, he stood completely still. When he tried to rejoin them, he found that he could no longer run with the speed of a gazelle. He was no longer the wild man that he had been. However, he had gained something in return for the speed that he had lost, for he now possessed greater understanding and wisdom. He returned to the woman, sat down at her feet, and looked into her face attentively. And that is the end of chapter 1.